Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna. This is Mark.
I'm Mark.
Yeah, so I really wanted to have this session because Mark and I have had some conversations about this in the past, and it's been like a really fun conversation. And while both of us have been community building for years, I think we learn something every single time we have this conversation with people. And so I have like one or two questions for us to answer, but I want people to be asking us questions because um, then we can have a really good conversation and we'll go off on tangents and um, hopefully it'll be a lot of fun. So I'll introduce myself. I'll go first and then Mark, you can do the same thing. I'm Jenna Pedersen. I am currently a developer advocate for Amazon Web Services. Before this, so my background is in software engineering. Before I joined AWS, I was running a small business and helping companies build products. And for the last 7 years before I joined AWS, I was working with startups. So I have kind of a wide range of experience with different size companies and different industries and businesses, and very much a generalist. So I like to do a lot of different things. So yeah. How about you, Mark?
Well, I am also an advocate for startups. So my work at AWS involves working with startup founders, investors, accelerators, and incubators to help folks understand how to build, grow, and scale on AWS. Prior to that, I worked at a place called Stack Overflow. Anyone that's out there that's a developer, you may have used that site one or two times. And before that, I was doing a lot of work building communities in the startup ecosystem based where I am in New York City. And that kind of evolved into writing a book called Community in a Box, which is all about building communities. And thank you for the shout out about Stack Overflow. But I will tell you, it was a fascinating experience to see what building a globally scaled community is like, completely in the online universe. So anyone that has questions about the online experience or the in-person offline experience would love to answer those questions, and really looking forward to the session today. So thanks, Jenna.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I think there's one question that I think it would be good for us to touch on, and I very much want the audience to as well if you have thoughts on this. But I think there's a lot of different definitions of community, and I'm curious what your definition is, and then I'll share mine as well. I think everybody has a different thought on it.
Uh, yeah, I keep it simple. I just
Yeah,
look at it as it's a group of people that have common interests that care about each other. And I think that's the two key pieces is that
yeah,
it has to be around an interest. You can have like people think maybe just like customers might be like an area of interest. Yeah, kind of, but you're really looking for something that's a little bit deeper, and that's the caring part. So I look at both of those sides as really critical for building what we can talk about later, which is this layer of trust that makes a community work.
yeah. I agree with all of that. I usually when I describe it, it's like shared values, um, like a sense of belonging. Like I want to be welcome there. I want to be able to share what I'm talking about. That emotional safety or psychological safety, I think, is really important. But yeah, the shared interests. Um, so is there anyone on the I don't like calling this a call because it's not really a phone call, but on the hop in that would like to share their definition? Either feel free to do it in chat, or if you want to request, if you want to request your to share your audio or video. I think I should be able to do that. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. If people request, then I think I'll see it. Also, there's road construction out right outside, so hopefully you're not hearing that. So Mark, tell me a little bit about like what was your time at Stack Overflow, and like how did that shape kind of what you're doing today?
Well, I think there's two sides to what I did at Stack Overflow. So let me try to see if I could explain this as simply as possible. There is the oh yeah,
I can answer.
yeah, you go ahead and answer. The one side was getting the experience of what the online community was like, and we're talking about 50 million people, unique individuals using Stack Overflow every month. Massive number, right? So 50 million unique people on a monthly basis visiting Stack Overflow from around the planet.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot that I learned about things like gamification, things I learned about what it takes to moderate such a massive amount of just content and community interactions. The other side of that was my specific work where I came onto Stack Overflow to build out their SaaS business. So anyone that is, following Stack Overflow, you may have heard of this product called Stack Overflow for Teams. So I was responsible for helping to launch that. And what was unique about that is we're trying to take this same dynamic that works in this online, globally accessible, public-facing website and bring that inside companies. So I did a lot of work, particularly with engineering organizations in places like, say, like JP Morgan Chase or Morgan Stanley or Verizon, like big, huge corporations, to understand how to marry some of the dynamics of a platform with how you build internal communities and how you build that trust, particularly in places that hadn't had a lot of experience with or success with collaborative solutions to share knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So I took a lot of insights, a lot of learning from both of those experiences.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm kind of one thing that I'm always interested in, especially with like um we're at Startup Week, so a lot of the people here are founders and entrepreneurs, mostly startups, but like some of us are, not. We're here to support. And I'm curious about what your thoughts on like how this is another hard question, and I don't have all the answers, so I'm definitely looking for other people to contribute here. But about the value of community and like how we quote unquote sell that to our teams and to our companies, to upper management if you have upper management or your co-founders, and like how to do that. I think just like a short answer for me is the value that it brings is related to like empowering your customers to work on your behalf, just organically. So if you have a very loyal customer, and they are talking a lot about you already, then empowering them and recognizing them as being someone who is already doing that for you. It's kind of like that, kind of like an extension to your team, like someone or a group of people who can really help you amplify your own message. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that, Mark.
I may put you on the spot a little bit, Jenna.
Okay.
Because you think about what we do
Yeah.
at AWS from myself from the startups perspective, working with founders and yourself as a developer advocate.
Yep.
I mean, AWS has supported folks like us for quite a number of years. I think starting off with Jeff Barr back in the days when AWS was barely a blip. But it's continued to grow as a group, and I'd be curious as kind of like your thoughts as to what is it that drives developer advocacy developer relations in a company like AWS? Like, what value do we provide
Yeah.
to the world, like
Yeah.
anyone that we're engaged with?
Yeah. I think, okay, that's a great question. And you mentioned the word developer relations. So I'm just going to touch on that a little bit. So we are both on the developer relations team. Our roles are they're technically under a marketing capacity, but that's a whole different conversation on what that means. But so what we are doing is working directly with developers, or what we call hands-on builders. Because you're on the startup team, it might be a little bit different. Your target people are a little bit different than ours. But so back to your question though about what our value is, I think like for what I try and do, like me adding value is by empowering developers to be able to solve their problems in their own company, or on their own, or whatever it happens to be. But by enabling them to figure out how to use AWS, I mean, it's a big thing. There's a lot of services, and we all know that. And so there's challenges with that. And so we try and break that down so that you are able to figure out, like, I need to use this service, and this is how I do it in order to solve my problem. Or this group of services, or maybe I don't need to use that service. Maybe I don't even need a service or a product from AWS. I actually need to just do this on my own. And so we try and educate you, help you figure out how to find the solution, help you make that solution, that sort of thing.
And what I think is so valuable about that work is that it means that you're fully engaged with builders, with our quote
Yeah.
unquote customers, or even not customers, right?
Yeah.
And that has actually led to some really interesting community work within AWS. For example, our Heroes program and the
Yeah.
Community Builders
Exactly.
program, by broader extension, the user group communities that we have
Yep.
globally. And so a key aspect of community and the value that it provides is that when you're engaged with the community at that deep level, and you have people that are doing that work, you get a sense of what people really care about.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's from our perspective, like building on AWS or building somewhere else, but we get that intangible but incredibly valuable voice of what people really care about. We can start to bring that back into our organizations to modify, change, or even build new types of programs and services that serve this constituency that cares a lot about what we're building. And the second thing it does, it helps identify true fans. So by extension, our passion for what we do is extended to people that are outside of our organization that are also super passionate, but may not be part of our organization, not employed by AWS. We want to be able to connect with those people and make them feel that they belong, going back to your definition of community. So that is, I think, a powerful mechanism for building that trust layer. And a lot of what I talk about when it comes to community is is a community really there if people aren't really trusting each other? Are they not having authentic conversations with each other? So that's, I think, when getting back to your question about value, like that is a way of connecting with customers on a much deeper level, so that could be an organization, that could be a group of people, constituency that goes out much broader than
Mm-hmm.
what you can do from your marketing or sales mechanisms.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say is there's so much valuable conversation that happens outside of the walls of our organization. And so if we
Yeah.
aren't able to plug into that in a way where people can trust us and not feel we're going to try to take over the conversation,
Yeah.
then it allows us to bring in innovation and ideas that are super important for us to keep it fresh, to keep it real
Yeah.
with the people that care about what we're delivering. And that's from, we've been talking from an AWS context, but that you could be a startup at the very beginning of your journey. You could be big, huge enterprise. You could be somewhere along that spectrum in your journey as you grow as an organization. But that deeper level of customer advocacy, that's what the value of a community can provide.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a couple things in there that I think are important that maybe we should touch on, and one of them is the building trust piece. If you're familiar with the leadership principles at Amazon, build trust is one of them, and that like with if you are, I mean it's important for any community, obviously, but if you're trying to build a community around your product to give in order to, what am I trying to say, to drive business value for your own company, building that trust is going to be really important. And I think that's one reason that I see why kind of our our team being separate from marketing is really important. And it doesn't mean it's not important for marketing to be there and to do their work, but we just kind of complement it in a little bit different way. And we are really trying to, build relationships and build those connections, and not just between, Mark and I and the community, but between different community members. And that's where like we see a lot of value can be added, is when a community member can help out or can empower other community members. And then what else was in there that you said that was interesting? The trust piece. Oh, I forgot it already, but
yeah, ultimately what it comes down to is, the value community can be challenging because there's this mindset that if you don't measure it, is it worth doing?
yeah,
And we've got to be careful there, because I think the metrics that tend to be used oftentimes from a community perspective are driven by the organization where a community sits. By that, if your community is within marketing, you may, as an organization, holistically want to measure marketing qualified leads.
yeah,
All this like big marketese language, right? But is that really relevant for measuring the value of a community? And my perspective, having run pretty large communities over time, is we've really got to rethink what those metrics really mean. So I often think of, what are the metrics that are just specifically driven around community itself? Like, what are the demographics of people that are involved? How often are people involved? Like some of that demographic engagement information. And then you start taking up a couple of layers closer to the things that your business might care about. So what are outcomes that you can define specifically from that type of engagement? So when you look at the people within that community, are you seeing particular growth or stickiness with the products or services your company is offering? Are you seeing better engagement with maybe leaders that are part of your community? So you can start to roll those up and get a bit closer to what that value means from a business standpoint. But you got to be careful of not trying to put community in this box where it's specifically trying to serve existing type of metrics. This is really important to kind of think outside of that, because if you put it within that framework, you're going to be tempted to want to push your marketing or sales or your service messaging to that community, and that's the first thing which ends up destroying trust. And I saw a lot of this in my time at Stack Overflow, where there'd be things that would come from Stack Overflow corporate that we bring down into the community, and it would cause all sorts of confusion, all sorts of misery, lots of misunderstanding. Some of those things will happen, and you got to be aware of that. But also be aware that if you're trying to push down these ideas, it looks like you're trying to take over the community, and you got to be super careful to not come across as the organization which is controlling the conversation. You really got to give the community the agency to control that conversation. That's why
Yeah.
you have moderators that aren't necessarily employed by your community. The moderator should be the fans, the people that are outside your
Yeah.
organization that are driving that.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, you said some big words in there, like moderation and like community management, and those, like, some of those are roles that you hire for, like community management. Like sometimes you hire for that, depending on the type of community you're building. And even with moderators too, but like Mark said, there's a lot of power in having the community actually be the people who moderate. So I have a question for the audience. And I would love for you to, drop into chat. What brought you to this session today? Are you uh, a startup who already has a community? You're a part of a community. Are you building a business that is like actually it's based on the existence of a community? Um, or maybe you're just here because you like to see our fun faces and you like to hear us talk. That's great too. But why are you here today? And like, what I want to make sure that we drive the conversation in the direction um, that you would like, and so that you get some value out of this session. I didn't prepare any other questions, so this is going to just be us talking. If if we don't if you're not a part of this, and really we want you to be a part of this, because it'll be a lot better that way. Okay, so I have Rachel Frosch is going to join us on screen or on audio, and ask a question or say something. I think I added you. There we go.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for being the first person.
Yeah, thank you. I was like, I'm not sure it works. I am creating an app, and I have like a prototype, but I haven't beta tested it yet. But it's in the shortest version possible. It's for supporting moms. So I'd say like my community is all moms or people that want to support moms, but it's probably I'm thinking of starting it with people that are new moms, and then having them use it and get comfortable with it with their friend groups, and then spreading it and having it grow with them, maybe, just to give myself a starting place.
Yeah, I like that. So how are you doing that? Like, do you have an existing group of moms that like are your friend moms, and that's kind of where you're starting? And this kind of goes to Jonathan's next question, that I'm going to just read out loud. Is it better to join existing communities and add value, or to create your own? I have thoughts on that, but I'll let you go, Rachel.
Well, I just created the prototype, and what I'm doing is just even the concept of it in my current communities. I found that people are just latching onto like the phrasing and the idea. But I think right now my next step is I'm going to reach out to like ECFE groups, or like even faith-based groups of moms that meet together in churches and things like that, and just see if they'd be willing to, in their insular groups, because I'm not ready for it to go like out, in those groups, be people that would just be testing it and seeing how what their usage is like, what their experience is like, what they would like to see. And so I'm thinking of starting with existing groups, but seeing how they use it.
Yeah, I like that. So related to Jonathan's question, is it better to join existing communities and add value, or to create your own? I think it's a lot easier to join existing and add value. I know, just back in some of my early days of community building, so one of the first like real things that I did here in the Twin Cities was, I was running a group called Twin Cities Geekettes. It was a women in tech meetup. We met once a month, I think, and we just found that there are a lot of other women like us that wanted to write code and have hack nights and get together and build relationships and a support group. And so it wasn't something that we were like, oh, we should start this. There were already groups of people already meeting, and we just kind of built around that and helped amplify the existence of it so that other people could be a part of it. So I think personally, going and finding the community that already exists is really valuable because starting from scratch, you're the only person, and it's hard to build a relationship just with yourself and to help yourself. And so it's a lot easier to do that. Mark, you have a lot of smiles, so I know you have opinions on this too.
Yeah. Look, I say community building it's super hard. I don't you can't beat around the bush on that because it does take a lot of resources. To me, having been in startups and been a founder of startups myself, launching a community in many respects feels like you're launching a startup with all the issues that are entailed with doing that. Now, that being said, there are instances when it might make sense to start from scratch. I'd say if you're maybe building an app or building something for a very specific niche audience, you're probably better off working within some existing places. For example, I work with a lot of startup founders that are building developer tools.
Yeah.
I tell them, unless you've originated as an open source project where you're having lots of contributors who are getting involved, then you're probably better off in working in places like Stack Overflow, maybe answering questions around your specific technology areas. If you're building an app for moms, like Rachel is describing, work with moms in existing communities instead of going from scratch. And the reason is because you need true fans. Like when I talk about the foundational elements of building community, we talked about some of them already. I mentioned trust, which is critically important. You got to have an environment which is open and welcoming to folks. But the other aspects of that community is you need to have you need to have a certain number of people involved, and you need super fans within that broader group that may be part of your community. And if you're able to work within those existing communities to get people that are super enthusiastic about what you're doing, then you can kind of branch off downstream and build your own community. But if you're starting from scratch, you got to think about, well, who else do I know would be interested? Who can I get to kind of help out in the beginning? One of the things I did, this is going back almost 7 years ago, was I launched a community for enterprise sales professionals.
Yep.
But it started with working with founders of B2B tech startups who had questions for me all the time about, hey, how do I sell to big, huge companies? And that was a lot of my experience in working with large enterprises as a startup founder. So I would spend a lot of time in these one-on-one conversations. And over time, I said, hey, would you be interested in a group where I brought people like yourselves together, like just founders, and we can talk about what it takes to sell into big companies? And that evolved into this thing that's called the Enterprise Sales Forum that still exists today. And that group, because I had this group of interested people I was already engaged with, that I can help launch the community with. And then over time, as that built and more people started to join that community, participate in events, I was able to get more people to volunteer and participate in the community at different levels. Some of them launched entirely new chapters in different cities. Some people just helped out in a particular city to help out in finding speakers or finding venues. So either approach, but you have to start somewhere. And if you don't have those true fans that totally believe in your vision and get the why of why your community needs to exist, it's going to be hard to get started in any context.
Yeah. When you so you had that group of people that you were already connected with. Were any of those people connected with each other yet? Or was that a piece of what you were doing, was you were finding a way to actually connect all of them as well?
Well, truth be told, this was really just a way of getting myself off the hook.
Exactly.
A lot of one-to-one meetings,
right,
which is so time-consuming. And I found myself saying the same things over and over again.
Yeah.
So building a community was, in some respects, I wasn't thinking about community the word itself didn't even like register in my mind as I'm doing this, but I figured, you know what? If I'm talking to this founder over here that's building a B2B dev tool startup, and there's this other founder that's also building something that's very similar, maybe those two should talk.
Yeah.
And if they talk, maybe they'll learn from each other, and then I'll bring some experts in that know that whole domain, and they could share what they did, and we can all learn from each other.
Yeah.
And just by collaborating in that way, in a group that has that same interest, that same kind of problem areas that they're working on, that would be a good starting place for having myself be kind of removing myself from the friction of making those connections happen.
Yeah.
And the community itself can be that mechanism for people to connect.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So sorry, I'm like a little distracted. Okay. So Vernon says, we are founding a business. I believe we can create community with customers and between customers. That is a value of ours. That's great. And then Allison has a question here about building. So how do you approach building a community for a niche group versus trying to be a community for the broadest possible audience within your industry? I think this is a really a really interesting question. And I don't have all the answers. Just off the top of my head, it feels like a couple of things. Number one, like defining who the group is, who the people that would be a part of your community are, and what their values are. I think that is super important. I also think, so in addition to doing that, I think evaluating whether it's too narrow or too broad is also really important. And part of that is because if your target group of people is very narrow, you're going to have a lot less people there in order to like for them to help each other and build relationships. It might be really good to like start that small and very, very narrow in order to build up those super fans or true fans like Mark is talking about. But I also think it could be really, really challenging. But also like there's challenges with like going really big too. Mark, I'm interested in your thoughts on this too.
Yeah. One of the key questions, again, this comes down to foundational aspects of building a community. You got to think about what your participation rate could potentially be. So for broader, public facing type communities, you're going to run into this ratio called the rule of 90-9-1, where 1% of your community is going to be super engaged, like the super fans that we've been talking about, 9% modestly engaged, and then 90% aren't going to really be engaged at all. So if you think about that type of ratio and you apply it to what your total addressable audience will be, or total addressable membership, if you have 100 people, well, that's not a lot of participation. So you really got to be a little bit strategic and think about what types of groups you want to bring on at the beginning in order to make this community launch. At the same time, though, a bit of a caveat: if you are going super niche, it may be okay to start with a smaller group. And I say that because if you have that shared trust amongst people and and a lot of similarities, then automatically they're gonna tend to want to be more engaged and participate in a more significant way than if you go very broad with people that may not necessarily be so in line with the vision that you have for the community. And it gets down to something you actually mentioned, Jenna, right off the bat, which is you really got to understand the clear why behind your community, because that's going to connect with the motivations for people who want to be involved.
Yeah.
And if you have that why set up at the very beginning and established, that's your vision. And that language that defines your vision is a language you're going to use to get people to be involved in your community, to invite them, to participate. So you got to, like, the very first thing I tell community builders or anyone that's thinking about community is understand why it needs to exist, and understand like who's going to connect with that vision and build from there. Now, getting, kind of thinking about broad versus narrow, another thing to consider is not just from the building standpoint, but also from how you scale standpoint. So the whole point of the session was building and scaling your community. I think a lot of people build and get started. The scale part's really challenging.
Yeah.
So the scale part's also a bit of a different way of thinking, because when you start off, you actually want to be smaller. You don't want to have everyone involved. And the reason is because you got to get the people that truly believe in your vision to get involved early on, and to be involved in whatever that community may be, whether it lives online, whether it lives offline, in person, whether it's a hybrid. You're going to have to get people that want to be interested in that community. There's going to have to be stuff, and that stuff is going to be, it could be events, it could be content, it could be conversations, and that one-to-one engagement, whatever that is. You need people at the beginning to get that going, because a community that doesn't have any sort of activity kind of feels like you're walking into a place that, like a party where no one's actually arrived yet, and thinking, okay, well, what do I do now? I have no idea. So there's a real balance. You want to start small with people that care about what you do, but you got to have enough people that care about what you do for that community to actually have any chance of building and growing.
Yeah. On that note of like, if it's too small and there's not enough activity or engagement, I definitely have joined Slack communities that are just like that. And I end up, I'm an introvert, so I don't always like put myself out there immediately. Well, I never do, basically. But when I join one of these Slack communities, I often just sit there and listen for a couple days or a week or times longer than that if it's really slow. And that's kind of my litmus test for figuring out, should I be a part of this or not? Am I a part of this? Do I see myself in this community? And if there's no one talking, it's really hard to do that.
Exactly. I gotta tell you, a lot of communities I've seen set up feels like a ghost town.
Yep.
And it's because you really got to think about. So I have I wrote this in my book, Community in a Box, but there's this principle I have called the 50, 500, 5,000 principle. And it kind of emerged from my work at Stack Overflow building internal communities, because we realized that if you didn't have at least a large enough core to start, then it was hard to get the community going downstream. And you really didn't have that long-term engagement and viability that allows the community to be healthy over time. So in essence, what 50, 500, 5,000 indicates is its magnitudes of scale. So 50 is that small seed group of people are super into your vision of what the community is about, your super fans, if you will. And you start to kind of figure out what are the dynamics of that community? How is it going to get going? Like, what topics are you going to talk about? How do you organize it? Are people going to have certain roles or play certain parts in managing and being part of that community? And then when you have some of those dynamics set up and you have kind of a flow, and you see that flow happening, whether you start a Slack group or a meetup, where it starts to catch fire. Like, people are starting to come and be involved. And so once you have that set up, then you can get to like a next level. So inviting people out maybe a little bit beyond that initial scope or audience that you're bringing in to be involved. And you're kind of testing dynamics and some of the theories you have about what the community is all about and how it works with this group that's a little bit, outside of your normal network or your reach, to see how they're engaging. And if you see that the engagement and all the metrics that you're using to monitor the growth and engagement levels in your community are working, then you can get a lot more broader, that 5,000 layer, to make it much more broad and invite folks that are very much outside of maybe your own network or existing community to bring them into the fold. And now that will allow you to scale, because now you can have enough people to enable you to do a few things. First off, having more people that want to step up and be involved in community. So thinking about volunteers. The second part is about the promotion. So that word of mouth is a very powerful mechanism for community growth and scale.
Yep.
So having more people obviously means more people talking about the community and the content within the community. So that's kind of a framework to keep in mind or to think about as you're looking to build a community from the get-go.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question. Well, okay, I wanted to just say one thing, kind of related to all that. We talk about, well, I mentioned like I've just joined Slack communities and other communities on a platform, and I think one piece of advice I would share with people is that don't think about the platform as the thing that is the community. That shouldn't be your first thought. It should be about the people and what they need and the value that they need. Not that, okay, I'm going to build a Slack community, because it doesn't work that way. And I think that is something that I've seen as I've joined some of these Slack communities. It's like, just because you've mass invited a bunch of people to a Slack community doesn't make a community. But that being said, like I'm a part of some really like, what is the word? Flourishing Slack communities. And I think it works because we have those shared values, those shared interests, and we had already built some of those relationships outside of Slack anyways, and I think that really helps. So it was just kind of like an additional way to engage people. Okay, so we have a question from Maria. Hi, Maria. What do each of you personally find the most difficult when building a community from scratch? And I know like Mark has talked a little bit about this already. I think like if you don't have the people there to actually build the relationships with each other, I think that is going to be really hard. It's also the other piece to that is you don't know what they need if there's no one there. Like, just because you think there's a need for a community doesn't necessarily mean that community should exist. It's when you start talking to people and see that they are asking for, like Mark was saying earlier, they're asking him a bunch of questions that all of them could be asking themselves. They just don't know each other yet. So I think that is kind of a way to look at starting from scratch problem.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's you got to if you're not able to connect to motivations, and these are like deep-seated internal motivations, because as Jenna was saying, I'm also part of like many Slack communities or communities that are on different platforms, and I'm not really involved in many of these because they don't really speak to things that I really need or care about deeply. So that's why having that why established is so critically important. And the other thing I'd say is there is always that mistake of kind of jumping forward and saying I'm going to build a platform. It's kind of like what companies do when they say we're going to bring in a tool and it's going to solve all of our problems.
Yep.
But the issue is that you didn't really go and look at, well, what is the impact you're trying to make? Like, why do this? Because if there's not any sort of inherent problem that you're trying to fix, then you're working at from a completely backwards perspective. It really needs to start from the problem or the motivation first, and then you work backwards from there to figure out, okay, well, what is the most sensible way of engaging these people that have this interest? Mm-hmm. And think about your platform from that perspective. And Slack could be where you land, and there's pluses and minuses of that. But I'd also encourage folks to look at, there's many different platforms now. I think what we're seeing more broadly, and this is kind of interesting from the AWS perspective, is that I see a lot of startups are now building community platforms specifically to do a lot of this work of managing or bringing people into the community, having different types of memberships, creating events or sponsoring events, like all different aspects of building a community and scaling it out. We are probably at the most the richest period of time in the community space for having platforms to host our communities.
Yeah. Okay, so we have Vernon is looking to ask a question or share a comment, so I just have added you. And then, so as you're getting set up,
there was one thing I wanted to mention, because you said what was like hard about getting started.
Yeah.
Thinking long term, meaning we talked about like platform as one thing, but whatever you do, you got to think about it from the standpoint of what does this look like, 3 months out, 6 months out, a year out. So you don't have that kind of roadmap ahead of time. You don't plan things accordingly. And what happens, it's easy to be enthusiastic at the onset. But what happens with every community, and I have to emphasize this, it happens with every community. What you're going to have is the curve of initial excitement.
Yeah.
And then you're going to get the trough of sadness.
Yep.
Because because a lot of that initial hype, people get excited about hype. Then hype dies out.
Yeah.
You got to be able to survive that trial of sorrow and sadness, because people will flake out or not be involved for whatever reasons. But it always happens. But if you continue with consistency and the passion that you had at the beginning, which is hard, I will say it's a little bit like gut wrenching. But if you continue, what you've done is you kind of proved out that your community can last for the long term. But you got to have things or ways of engaging and getting people excited and involved. And you can't do that if you don't have things planned ahead of time, whether it's events, whether it's how to engage, whether it's content. Have that, just think through that at the initial stages.
Yeah. Okay, we have one more question, but I want to just add a piece to that on what you were just talking about. And I'm sure Maria's like on the other end, kind of laughing about this. So Maria's an executive director for a board that I'm a part of, Ministar, which is an organization that we exist to connect the different parts of the tech community here in Minnesota. Cool. And we've been around for 16 years. And one of the challenges we've been seeing over the last few years is like our longtime supporters don't always attend our events anymore, but they're still like super active in the community and they're super active as part of the Ministar community. And so we've been trying to figure out like, how do we keep them engaged? And I feel like maybe they're in that, maybe it's not a trough of sorrow quite right now. They're still a part of the community. They're still there. But it is definitely keeping us thinking about like, how do we continue to engage them and the people who are new to the community, because we have a lot of people who are new and who are just joining. And so I think that's definitely something that we think about a lot. Okay. Jonathan's question, building a community takes a lot of time. How do you find that you're compensated for that time invested?
Well, I think, again, it comes down to, if you have a vision and you've done the work to establish where you want this community to be long term, you got to understand ultimately how it connects with the things that are important for you. And I'll readily admit, sometimes it's hard to see that from the onset. I certainly didn't with the enterprise sales forum. I didn't realize that I'd have 25 chapters around the globe. Like that was not part of the plan. But I think it comes down to what's really important for you, and and not to be afraid of that maybe changing or shifting over time. As the community potentially grows and scales and does different things. I've seen folks that started communities that didn't have any real expectations, and that ended up becoming a business,
Mm-hmm.
with like a revenue model and acquisition strategies and all of that. It was kind of like a startup that emerged from a community. So I think ultimately you got to see like what is important that you're getting out of community that's fulfilling your needs as a builder. Uh, a good example is open source community, which I do some work in. Uh, these start as projects that scratch your own niche as a developer. Like, oh, I didn't really see like, such and such language was really serving my needs. Like, I'm going to do this other thing. Or maybe there's a platform that's not really managing data in the cloud as much as to the way I think it should be done. So let me start that off as an open source project to see if other people have the same need, and then it kind of builds from there. And so a lot of that is just that scratching of your own itch.
Mm-hmm.
That might be enough. I think if you're doing this from a company perspective or an organization perspective, I would say that community or the work of community is very all encompassing. While it could be super impactful, it could be super draining as well. We haven't really touched on this as either. I know we're coming up towards time, but burnout is a significant thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you see a lot of this discussion of burnout in different community management circles, because it is, as I said before, in many respects, it has some of the same dynamics of launching a startup, because it can be all consuming. So make sure that if the CEO comes down and says, we need to launch a community, and they say you're the person to do that, have a conversation about what that compensation is going to look like and what support is going to be provided. One of the things that I've seen time and time again is organizations thinking, oh, we'll bring on one person or maybe have someone that's already part of our organization as the community manager that does everything. That doesn't scale, and it's rarely successful. It really requires a lot broader type of strategy.
Yes.
That strategy requires resources and it requires talent. There's no getting away from that.
Yeah.
Even if you're doing a community by yourself, just because of your own interests, I still say you can't do it by yourself. You need a team. That's why when I started communities, like a good example is the Clubhouse work that I've been doing within AWS. Even though I may have had the idea, I brought on people within my team and other teams to contribute and participate. And so that seed core of organizers allowed the community to build on Clubhouse, and we've had some really great success with that. But you can't lone wolf community. It's not healthy.
Yeah, totally agree with that. You touched on a lot of emotions that I've had over the last decade or so of my own community building experience. And Jonathan's question is a really good question. I mean, everything I was doing up until about a year and a half ago was all volunteer. And I frankly was really burnt out, and it was really hard to stay engaged. And the only reason I did was because those were my communities. And I saw myself in there and I was getting value from it. And so that's why I stayed as long as I did in some of those communities. And so I've had to just on the subject of burnout, I've really had to kind of readjust how I engage with certain communities and how I continue supporting. I mean, part of my reason for joining AWS is I love this work and I wanted to continue doing this work, and I couldn't continue doing it at the scale I was, which was a very small scale, and continue to scale it without and still be able to pay my mortgage, that kind of thing. So that was one of the reasons why I joined. And an extension to that is I didn't even know the AWS community existed, but I was a user of AWS for many, many years. And so I actually want to help fix that. I want to help figure out how like other developers like myself can actually benefit from this community, whether it's actually getting something from the community or taking or giving back to it. And so yeah, it's a lot of work. So definitely on the topic of burnout, like it's really important, I think, to evaluate kind of where you're at and what you need from the community and whether you're getting it or not. But then also, especially if you're doing this in a company, making sure that you're actually compensated for it in some way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, and I think also, think about the expectations of time. This goes to Maria's question. It's, you got to have boundaries.
Yep.
And I think we're both on, have had many of the same experiences, Jenna, just maybe not having those boundaries set up, so that what happens, because it will happen, the community will bleed into other aspects of what you're doing, in your work, in your personal life. The problems of your community members end up being like the problems that you start to own.
Yeah.
And it's a huge burden to take that on.
Yeah.
Don't allow that to take over your life, because I think that's an important thing. So just make sure you understand like how much time you are putting into your working community, whether it's for inside an organization, for like a company effort, or your own outside interests. Just keep track of it and understand if it if it started to bleed into other things, if you start canceling other things that are also important for you, like your family time, your private time, work, whatever it may be, if it starts bleeding over, maybe it's a time to maybe do a reset and start to put some of those boundaries in place.
Yeah. I think one other important piece to that is like learning to say no, and knowing that just because you said no, nothing's gonna fall apart. I'm terrible at it. And yeah, I'm terrible at it. So it's something I'm still learning how to do. And Maria has been very supportive in my saying no. And I think I like to think that I'm supportive of her saying no as well. And we just know that like it's going to be okay. Nothing's in our case of the mini star community. We know that like we're not saving lives here. So it's okay if something doesn't get done, or I don't attend every event. We had an event yesterday and I didn't go to it. So so like there's stuff like that. You gotta just be able to set those boundaries. I think that's super important.
Yeah, just a classic one was my newsletter.
Yeah.
I love having the fact and being proud of the fact that I've been able to get that out on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
But as anyone that creates content, that is time consuming.
Yes.
I do 2 of those newsletters. And so I've given myself the agency, the permission to say, I don't have to do the newsletter this week. No one's going to die. No one's going to be like, I have people actually go and say like, oh, what happened to the newsletter? I just have to tell them like, I have to take a break.
Yeah.
But people understand, like you got to understand that, as part of the community, people do understand. Okay.
Yeah.
But if you don't say no at the onset, people don't know what to expect. And so having those boundaries is a way of setting those expectations so you can say no and not feel guilty, which if you're, like Jenna or myself, we do community work because we have that heart. We want to help people. Ultimately, that's why we get involved in these things and why we do the work that we do. But, that does have that, if you don't have that space between the work you do from community with what you need to do to restore yourself and feel that you are your best self, then you're not going to be able to give to your community.
Yeah. Yeah. Maria just said that, like when you practice self-care and boundaries, you lead by example for the rest of the community, which is absolutely true.
Which also goes into another thing, which I realized the critical importance of. You always got to be recruiting a sense of bringing people on to take that load of community work off your shoulders. it's very easy, particularly if you're a founder of a community, to want to do everything.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to delegate and give people roles, give people jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And what you'll find is that for the most part, people that are in part of your community that value what you do want to help, want to be involved. So bring them into the fold. And every so often I would have just events just for people that express some interest. And I have just events for folks that had that interest level, just to chat about, okay, well, what types of things would you want to do, and to get to know other people that are interested in volunteering. So that ends up being kind of like a sub community that, one of the things I also did was I had someone that kind of ran that and kind of owned that as a role. So I stepped away from that as an active part of leading a community.
Yeah. Okay, so we're at the top of the hour. Are there any last minute questions that we can answer? Or and if there's not, Mark and I are both active on social media. The links to either follow us or send us a message are at the bottom of your little hop-in panel. Great. Good idea, Mark. Paste it right in there in the chat. Yes, thank you all for joining and for asking questions and sharing information about what you're doing. I think this is, I always learn so much from these, and like I just mentioned, like maybe we need a session on mental health and community building next, and I've got 2 other ideas. Like one thing that I think is another interesting topic that you brought up just a minute ago is like enabling your volunteers and figuring out how to enable them in a way where they're engaged regularly and they can provide value, and they also get value out of it. So ideas for the future.
Love it. Be happy to participate in those.
Yeah.
And everyone else that's listening, please.
Yeah,
let's make that happen.